Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this EPC update and post-summit briefing, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union, and today focusing solely on the outcome of the European Council that has just ended. We haven't had the press conferences yet. We haven't seen the final conclusions. We saw some conclusions from yesterday, but we will do our best nevertheless to guide you through what has happened and what it all means. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the EPC, and with me, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies. As always, totally interactive, some questions from me to Fabian and Janis, and also if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them. You can either click on the raised hands button and I will ask you to unmute yourself when the time comes, or you can put your questions in the Q&A box. And as always, please be as brief as possible so I can see at a glance what your question is and who it is for. So let us jump straight in. We have a great deal to discuss. Janis, just give us a sense, will you? Charles Michel, President of the Council, in his invitation letter to EU leaders, described it as a pivotal European Council. Was it? What was on the agenda? And where did EU leaders focus their attention? And did they take any concrete decisions?
Well, first of all, it was an important European Council with a very large agenda, starting yesterday with a discussion, obviously, on Ukraine, but also on enlargement in more general, and also what that would mean with respect to EU reform. And they had a discussion on the multi-annual financial framework. That's what happened yesterday. Today on the agenda, they had the Middle East, migration, security, defense, and also strategic agenda, where, as you said, we're still awaiting the final draft of the conclusions, especially those from day 2 of the summit. So a large agenda, some key aspects, key issues of the agenda, especially with Ukraine, enlargement reform and the multi-annual framework. On Ukraine, the decision to open accessions, but we all know that even though that decision was taken, probably at a heavy price, because it required Orban to leave the room in order to have a unanimous decision. But we know that there is a long and bumpy road ahead with ample opportunities to veto when you open certain chapters, when you close them at the end of the process, then probably also referenda. So that process is extremely long, with a long way of vetoes. With respect to the multi-financial review, we have again a 20 versus 1 decision, or at least a situation, with 26 member states, so all but Hungary, Orban's Hungary, firmly supporting the compromise. If you look into the negotiating box, it's roughly around 21 billion of new money, which is far less than what the Commission had originally asked for. And there will be a next attempt to get a deal among all 27, including Hungary, and we'll see what the price Orban will raise for that one. But there's an alternative, i.e. that member states, the 26, do it outside the EU budget.
Let's come back.
We'll discuss that.
To that a little
and
bit
last
later.
but not least, what we hear is that there are no conclusion on Gaza and Hamas, so there were no conclusion taken today on that, which is big news, because at least last time there was a long discussion again on Gaza, Hamas, difficult one, but they had some conclusions. They came to some, but today they weren't able to do so.
So I know you'll be keeping an eye out for those conclusions should they come in while we're talking. And what do we read into the fact that there will be no conclusions on Gaza? We'll come back to that later on. Also want to come back to the question of Hungary later on, Fabian. But in very broad terms, it was described by Ursula von der Leyen. She said, this is a strategic decision and a day that will remain engraved in the history of our union. Was she right? How significant a moment is this?
I think certainly it is a significant moment. It is an important signal, which has been given not just to Ukraine, but also to other countries. It's an important signal also for the world, because it still shows that the EU is moving ahead and supporting Ukraine, also showing willingness, at least 26 of them showing willingness to integrate Ukraine. How significant is this day going to be in hindsight? Well, that very much depends on what happens next, and whether the promises which are being made can be kept. And that's not just a question of Orban and Hungary blocking things going forward, even though that is certainly going to be part of the discussion. But it is also a question of, are we going to make the right steps which are necessary to make this enlargement happen? How do we deal with the tricky questions, including the tricky question of money, where we haven't made progress in the way we should have? So I think this is at best a step in the right direction, even though it wasn't unanimous. But it's really, in my view, a very big question about what happens next and whether we're just simply going to continue with well, signals and symbolic decisions rather than making the real progress which is needed. And we shouldn't forget that there is a very pressing need, which is to provide financing to Ukraine now, because the war is ongoing. Ukraine needs this support, especially since also the US is difficult at the moment.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there Viktor Orban, of course, who left the room. Made a tactical retreat, let's call it, for a cup of coffee in order not to vote, apparently at the suggestion of the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. But he said afterwards that he didn't veto opening the accession negotiations because there would be plenty of opportunities to block the process later on. He said, I'll have 75 more occasions to do this. So I suppose that is when we say it depends what happens next. Obviously, that is part of the equation, the capacity of Hungary to put roadblocks in the way time and time again. But taking that aside for a moment, in terms of what will be the key issues, Fabian, in these negotiations, obviously agriculture will be a huge issue because of the Ukrainian economy. What do you think are going to be the most difficult things? Do they relate to rule of law and all those sorts of issues? Where will the sticking points be? And what sort of time frame do you think we're talking about? Fabian?
I think when we're looking at the sticking points or the barriers, we have to really look very broadly. This is not a question of having one or two areas where we need to adjust things. Clearly, there are areas like that where there have to be big changes. I would say, for example, the common agricultural policy, for me, is one of the big areas we need to tackle. We should be tackling it anyway, but with Ukraine, there's an added significance to that. But it's really about looking at the way the European Union works, and looking at what are the strategic goals we're trying to achieve together, and then adjusting the means, the instruments, the financing, the competences to those strategic goals. That's a discussion which is not happening at all at the moment. We have had a little bit of a discussion around institutional reforms. Do we need treaty reform? Do we not? But even there, I have to say that when we look at, for example, decision making, which we have highlighted before as one of the sticking points, because we had already seen that Orban would use it as a way of blackmailing the other member states, there has been no action. It has been noted that the decision-making procedure is no longer fit for purpose, but nothing has happened. And I fear that this is rather the picture across the board, that apart from a bit of rhetoric, we haven't even started the strategic discussion, let alone start getting ready.
Want to come back to what the conclusions say about the internal reform process and also what they say about financing of the EU in future. But Janis, just in terms of the next steps in the enlargement negotiations, what's the process now? Can we put a time frame on this at all? And is it true, is Orban right that he will have, he puts it 75, I doubt he sat down and counted precisely where he came up with that number from, but this continual ability to block progress?
Well, first of all, let me say let's assume if there would not have been a decision to open negotiations yesterday. I think because we were saying, what's the signal coming from that decision? But what would have been the signal coming out of a no or no decision with respect to opening negotiations, and the signal to Ukraine, to Putin, to the US, which increasingly is a strong signal to give, but also to Europe's own publics and to the EU's member states' own public. So I think from that perspective, it was very important. Now, with respect to the next steps, the Council must adopt the negotiating frameworks to start negotiations on first chapter or individual chapters. That in itself, by the way, requires unanimity. So that's one of one of the 70 or 75, whatever how you want to count it, decisions that have to be taken unanimously. Ukraine must fulfill relevant steps, which have been set out in the the recommendations of the Commission. So also Ukraine side still has to fulfill certain things in order for the Council then to say, let's start negotiations on the first chapters. And by the way, not only opening chapters requires unanimity, also closing chapters requires unanimity. To conclude the overall process, now we're talking about very, very long term, also means that requires unanimity. So the estimate of more than 70 is correct. So there are a lot of options how one can try to veto. And let's not also forget that now it is obviously Orban's Hungary, which is difficult. But who's to say who in the process of enlargement, again, of accession, especially when it comes to Ukraine, over many years, there won't be also others who will have individual problems and hesitations. So the picture is even more complex. So if you ask, when will, and I reckon you meant Ukraine, join the EU, my crystal ball is clearly not clear enough to look deep inside of it. There are too many variables. What will be the developments with respect to the war in Ukraine? What is the readiness of candidate countries to prepare themselves for accessions? The ability of the EU to reform itself? The outcome of the EU elections even will affect that process. So it is extremely difficult to make a prognosis. What we can say, it will take long, and it will definitely be difficult. But
and
again,
you talked there about the ability of the EU to reform itself. And one thing, the conclusions stress that the two tracks, the accession negotiations, the internal reforms needed to prepare for enlargement, should advance, and I'm quoting here, in parallel. Why are they putting so much emphasis on this parallel process? And you hear some Ukrainian concerns that this could be another means to put roadblocks in the way of progress, that it could be another way to delay them joining. Are those concerns justified? Or do you sense really among EU leaders that it is time to bite the bullet of the reforms that are needed if the EU is to be able to function effectively as it is now, let alone with more member states?
Well, first of all, with respect to Ukraine, yes, there are these hesitations, but these hesitations, you will also hear them in the Western Balkan countries. You hear that actually, can one trust the EU that it's ready to enlarge? Can you trust the EU when they talk about internal reform? Or do they use the argument of internal reform, absorption capacity, the word? I think integration capacity would be the better word. Can you trust the EU 27 that they are not using this argument in order to actually not make the EU enlarge? And let's not forget, also among the EU 27, there are split opinions. There are some in the EU who say you can enlarge on the basis of the Lisbon Treaty. There are others who say you can enlarge on the basis of the Lisbon Treaty with changes which can be done within the treaties, and others who say you need a reform, an amendment of the EU treaties, either something which is more concrete, surgical, or something which is more fundamental. So you also have a lot of different positions within the European Union, and then you have distrust. Can you trust the EU that it will reform? Can you trust the countries who want to accede that they will do the reforms they have to do? So you need to link these two processes: roadmaps with respect to enlargement, roadmap with respect to EU reform. So you need to think these two things together.
Thank you, Fabian. I mean, given the emphasis you put in your first reply to me on looking at the way the EU works, but you very much put the emphasis on the strategic goals and then the instruments that follow. But do you take encouragement from this emphasis on we need to do our homework too? It's not just about the applicant countries. It's not just about Ukraine and Moldova. We need to address this, and we need, indeed, they're talking about laying the groundwork for this and having a roadmap due to be agreed by next summer. Does that give you any more optimism that they are actually ready to face up to these difficult decisions?
I think it certainly is better than the alternative, because not explicitly, but implicitly, we've had a situation where essentially member states have said, we're not even going to consider enlargement before we have done all these reforms. So essentially, it meant putting off enlargement indefinitely. At least there's now a recognition that this has to happen in parallel, that there is no way that we can do all of these reforms first and then move on to enlargement. So that's the one bit of positive news I would take out of this. But beyond that, the reality is now comes the hard bit. Now comes actually sitting down, not only defining what is it we want to do, but then also talking about how do we deal with the very hard political choices which have to be made. How do we deal with the resistance which is going to be there? We already know that Hungary is going to be resistant, and I suspect that there are some countries which are rather happy that they have someone they can hide behind when it comes to some of these hard choices. When we are talking about, for example, decision-making processes, we've pointed out in the past that you can often end up in a situation where you're sacrificing ambition for unity. So are we going to change voting systems? Are we going to have more qualified majority voting? For some of these, we don't need a roadmap. We don't need a long process. There are things which could be done now. There could be choices, for example, to activate the passerelle clauses in particular areas. We have another topic on the agenda where you could make choices now, the EU budget, where you could make forward-looking decisions at this moment in time. But that's when it starts to hurt, and that's when it gets difficult politically. And that's, I think, where we are going to see that this process gets more and more difficult and starts to slow down. And
I'll
I
come
think
back on the
this is
question of the EU
exactly the
budget.
point when we will then also disappoint Ukraine, disappoint the other countries, and not fulfill the geopolitical imperative which we've said we have recognized.
I'll come back on the budget question in a moment. There is a question from the audience on it, and also, of course, on the crucial question, as Janis mentioned earlier, not decided, not agreed because of Hungary, the money for Ukraine. But just to that point about the roadmap, Janis, what are we talking about when we talk about a roadmap? Is it beginning to shape up already? Where are we in that process? Do we know what that roadmap will look like?
No, we don't know. We know, well, the positive thing is that we have a recognition that we need some form of a roadmap, and that we need to think both, as we were saying earlier, enlargement and reform together, that we need to synchronize, that we need to find a way of moving step by step on each of the two tracks in order to move forward. But we don't have anything concrete. For example, we don't even know actually when we talk about reform what we mean in terms of internal reforms. We already mentioned policy reforms with respect to agricultural policy, cohesion, also security and defense, by the way, especially if you have in mind that potentially we're talking about Ukraine joining. We need to talk about issues related to governance and institutional reform. Again, how far will they go? Fabian was talking about QMV, where we have some member states who say we're ready to use the passerelle clauses, but if you look in more detail, and they're the minority, by the way, if you look in more detail, you will see that they also differ individually on where they're ready to move towards a potentially qualified majority or super qualified majority, or any forms of moving away at least from unanimity. So there are huge differences. And then we mentioned budgetary adaptations. And this is not about only the MFF review, which is now happening, but also the negotiation negotiations with respect to the next MFF and thereafter, if you think even longer, because enlargement might happen not before, not the next, but the next after the next MFF will have to be concluded. So there is no clarity of what the roadmap or maps shall look like, how they should be linked. And I think that the problem is that we need to keep the ball rolling. And my appreciation of things is that after the EP elections, the situation will not improve, not because of the outcome of the election in terms of what it means for the composition of the European Parliament and whether it makes life more difficult for the next commission. Both will be more complicated because of the fragmentation of the parliament. But also the outcome of the EP elections, which probably will see a strengthening of anti-EU forces, and that's the likelihood at this point in time, of what the influence that will have of national policymakers with respect to their readiness. So you need to have decisions actually before the EP elections with respect to the roadmap and concrete elements of how to keep the ball rolling. We're not there yet. The Belgians say that during their presidency, this will be one of their focus, but let's see how concrete it will be and whether the 27 will be able to agree.
I want to talk shortly about the MFF, but I first want to talk about the package for Ukraine, the 50 billion, which, as Fabian said, so much more. I mean, Ukraine needs that money now, particularly in light of what is happening in the US. Not getting the money from the US at the moment. It looks like they are apparently, the Senate is going to come back into session next week to talk about it, but they're not going to get money this way from the EU or the US pre-Christmas. Hungary blocked, as we've said, doing a deal on this. I mean, the cynic might say, well, they agreed on the opening of accession negotiations because they can block that all the way down the line. So that wasn't in Orban's eyes much of a concession. This is where he thinks he's got even more leverage and can extract more from the EU. We'll come back on that. But is there any way to get round this Hungarian veto? And if there is a way, would it be wise for the EU 26 to go down that road, Fabian? I'm thinking here the Irish Taoiseach was among those, Leo Varadkar, who said, well, we could do this at 26. We could do it bilaterally. But many leaders indicating that was not their preferred way to proceed, that they wanted to do it by unanimity. Can they get round it? Should they try and get round it? Or do they have to bring Hungary on board politically, if not legally? Fabian.
I think the first question has to be, what would it mean bringing Hungary on board? Do you have to find another 10 billion to pay off Hungary? What is the price for Hungary to be on board? And I think that already shows, at least in my view, that's not the route you should go down. I think what has to be clear is that Ukraine receives this money. And if that money is not going to go through the central route, which I think is the preferred route, but if it cannot go that way, then it has to go another way. And I think that's where the Taoiseach is absolutely right. You cannot afford to have this money held up by a single member blackmailing the rest of the European Union. But I think it also points to a broader question about how do we construct budgets at the European level? How are we going to deal with these enormous amounts of extra funding which are needed across many different areas? It's not just Ukraine we're talking about. And there, I think we also have to have a discussion about how do we raise revenues? How do we actually raise borrowing at the European level? So it's a much broader discussion, which should have taken or should have at least started earlier. And this is just a symptom of a rather dysfunctional financial system at the European level.
Janis?
Well, first of all, I think that what Fabian was describing is correct. The question is, how do you now find a way, and in parallel, as we're having the update, I'm also looking at what's happening in the outside world, to find what von der Leyen in the press conference has called an operational solution, i.e. a way to deal with a problem where potentially we might in January, or maybe even later, not have an agreement among the 27, meaning that Orban would agree, also because the price he's asking is probably too high. So there needs to be an alternative solution outside the EU budget framework, and a solution which allows member states to have national contribution to support Ukraine with a firm commitment that the money will go to Ukraine. And I think the signal that actually came out yesterday was that 26 member states are ready to provide the 50 billion. So you will get it. That's not the issue. The question is how we will do it. And so you need that alternative path, the operational solution, as von der Leyen calls it, and in order also to put pressure on Orban. Will it work? I don't know. I'm not sure, because he doesn't care. What he cares about is to get the money and to also score at home, and to showcase that he's the one who's defending the interests of his country. But you need to have that threat of an alternative pathway, which is going to be much more complicated. It's going to be more complicated. It's not the avenue that one would want to go along, but potentially it might be needed. If you have these 27 versus 1 solution, situation, 26 versus 1 situations, you need to find practical solutions to circumvent them.
I want to come back on the broader question of what we do about Hungary, but in a bit, because I want to talk about the budget first. But Fabian, you wanted to jump back in.
I just wanted to just one sentence. I think it is appalling that we end up at this moment again because we knew it was coming. And this, I think, is the big message we really should take away from this. We've known that Orban thinks this way, acts this way, will use his veto in this way, and still we did nothing to prevent us getting in the same situation again after we had already been there. And this is, I think, the big message for me has to be, okay, we have to find an operational solution now. I fully agree with that. We have to move forward at this moment in time. And clearly that's not going to be pretty, because you are going to have to make compromises to achieve that. But
okay, let me
that
stay with
also
that
the
for a moment then. Yeah, let me stay with that because
is that also the moment when we actually start talking about how do we prevent this from happening again and again?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, when you say it's not going to be pretty, the Commission has been accused by MEPs of giving into blackmail because they unfroze, you mentioned it earlier, that 10 billion euro of funds that had been frozen over human rights and rule of law concerns. Was that, do you think, you saying it's not going to be pretty, but we have to do it? But I understood you earlier, Fabian, to be saying that it was a mistake to do that because you said, what's the price next time? Do you believe that was a mistake on the part of the Commission to unblock it? Or was it inevitable realpolitik? They had really no choice to make progress, and given the symbolic importance of opening those accession negotiations, because that follows up very much the point you just made. A thought on that?
I think the question is not what you have to do when you are at that moment in time. Essentially, we should have never gotten into that situation where you then have to make these choices. It might
how
well
do you
be
avoid it? How do you not get into that situation?
you avoid it by removing the possibility for one country to
Right.
veto the kind of common decisions the other 26 want to take together. If that had been the case beforehand, then we could have had a very different discussion at this moment in time. And it might well be. I don't. I have suspicions, but I don't know exactly what the assessment was within the Commission, whether it was an acceptance of the pressure coming from Hungary or whether it was an objective decision which had nothing to do with that. But the point is, when you have to take it at this moment in time, it will always look bad, whatever you're going to do. Either it will look bad because you are stopping the process, which is necessary to signal the right things to Ukraine and others, or you're freeing up the money, which looks like Orban has won.
Yeah.
And whether that is in reality the case or not, you should not get into these
Perception
situations.
matters.
And this is not the fault of the Commission alone. I think the institutions have to also take part of the responsibility for this, but this is also very much the fault of the member states, because the member states should have known that we're going to end up at this point again.
Okay. Janis, do you believe unfreezing the funding was the right thing to do, or the only thing to do at that moment, or was it a mistake? And how do we proceed? Let's assume you come to January and Hungary again tries to extract more concessions in return for the Ukraine package, in return for the MFF, which I will come back to, I promise, and I'll take the audience question on that in a moment. Can we continue to go on like this? I also want to come back on whether walking out of the room is sort of legal. Well, you know, is this going to be how the EU resolves these difficult dilemmas in future? But just first on how the EU should respond. Should it have done what it did this week? And what does it do when it tries it again in January?
First of all, and I think Fabian is right here, we got to this point, and there's a history to that. And the history goes well back, and there's a lot you can discuss about it, and you can put blame. So now to say it is the Commission which has to be blamed for the decision which was taken on Wednesday, I think is too easy. But because we got to the situation also, for example, because of how the EPP treated Fidesz and Orban over many, many years. And so there's a history behind all that and how we got into the situation we are now. The question is, how do you deal with it now? And that is extremely difficult. Let's be serious about that. One, this is a union of member states, and unanimity is a rule, and for different reasons. And by the way, also the other 26 want to prevail unanimity in many areas. They do not want to move away. So it is not as easy, obviously. However, having said that, we need to probably think more politically. We need to politically outmaneuver how Orban is operating, which is difficult because we, the other 26 in this case, are not also in line with each other every time, also with the EU institutions. So those who are standing across Orban do not have a unified position on how to deal with this. And I think we need to be aware of that. The positive note is that we now have a 26 versus 1 situation. There were some who were saying Fico might come in. He didn't because he cares about other things. But the important thing is that
exactly
that is the big change. And I think then will have to be some politically more thinking as to how to deal with Orban in a 26 versus 1 situation. But that has costs affiliated to it because it means that the machinery of the EU. So when we were talking about the 50 billion for Ukraine, there is a solution to that. It's more complicated. It's probably not the best. There's a solution to that. But with respect to the MFF, how do you deal with that? No? Yeah. And so there will be costs associated with the fact that he will be pressing. We need to counter-press politically, and that's not easy. So that's why the 27 in the room, or the 26, plus the president of the Commission and the president of the European Council, tried to find a solution. And it is extremely difficult to square the circle.
Can I just ask a question that puzzled me?
Where we are now.
Yeah, can I just ask a question that puzzled me? He left the room, went to have a coffee, as I say, apparently suggested by Chancellor Scholz.
No, he was asked by Scholz.
Has this happened before? And as I had understood it, in the past, if an EU leader leaves, their ambassador, their permanent representative, slips into their seat and represents them. You simply don't leave an empty chair. So do the rules actually allow this, or did they all just say, well, we will turn a blind eye because it works? And are we seeing a precedent now, as I say, for the future, whether you see it as a positive way of solving the problem or a negative way of solving it? Could this lay a precedent for the future?
Well, I think there's a technical response to that question and a political response. The technical is that we've seen often that individual heads of state and government were not in the room when the decision was taken, even if that decision was unanimous. They, most of the times when leaving, said the head of state government of another country, XYZ, will replace me. He or she will be able to replace me in the situation where decisions have to be taken, and they had coordinated themselves. And the rules allow that. You can they explicitly allow it, that if not all are present, in the room, the European Council can still have a decision. But that's by the choice of the person who wants to leave. Now, yesterday he was asked to leave. It was his own choice to leave. But it is a totally different situation like the one I was describing earlier. So technically, legally, it's possible. Politically, this was a move where the question then is that a precedent for the future? And I don't think it actually is.
Okay.
Because as we were describing earlier, he left the room knowing that there are ample other opportunities to veto with respect to the concrete decision which was taken regarding Ukraine. So it is a situation where the price there was not a strong price to pay, and nobody is excluded. There were now some who were saying, does that mean that others will in future be asked to leave the room when decisions are taken? That's not the reality of how the EU works.
Fabian, quick one if you would, because I want to move to the MFF.
Yeah. I just wanted to add to this, and that's also relevant for the MFF. I think we are obviously focusing a lot on Hungary and Orban at the moment, but the reality is that this is also a very significant deterioration of the capacity of the European Union to make these kind of decisions, because other countries will look at this and they will start to think, well, maybe there are situations under which I will be the one who is not going to play along, where I will be the one who's blocking things. And particularly looking ahead, the populists are getting stronger, the neo-nativists, neo-nationalist populists. And in my view, they will focus on three topics. They will focus on migration, they will focus on climate, and they will focus on Ukraine. So it will get much, much more difficult in future. So it's not just Orban, it's not just dealing with this kleptocrat, which is difficult. But the problem which is underlying this is far, far greater.
Just a comment really from John Palmer in our audience. Why not support Hungary's demands for linguistic rights for the Hungarian linguistic minority in Ukraine and see how sincere Orban's protestations about Ukraine really are? So call him out if he makes claims. Janis?
They called him out yesterday. What you hear from the discussions they had in the European Council, by the way, also before the European Council, because there were a lot of attempts to persuade him to move in a different direction. They were calling him out, and actually he ran out of arguments. But that doesn't matter. No. Because what matters is he comes out, he says this is the wrong decision, and I'm still fighting. I'm the lonely wolf who's standing. I'm right. I'm gonna be right, and all that. Okay. So calling him out or making certain proposals which actually he's not really interested in terms of compromise won't do the trick. Just one point, and that is something which makes me very concerned when you see what happened yesterday. And I have the sense that many also politicians in member states ask themselves as to whether the EU is the answer, and I mean about mainstream politicians, ask themselves whether the EU actually is the right response to some of the challenges we're facing. And if you see what happened yesterday, there will be an increasing notion, look, the EU has the limits it has. It cannot proceed. There will always be the situations where you will have one or the other or more countries who are obstructing. So is the EU really the answer? Now, my answer is clear. It is the answer to most of the problems and challenges, major challenges we're facing. But there is this sentiment that it might not be. So what is the meta message which comes out of what happened yesterday and in previous summits is that actually we're not sure that the EU is the answer. So maybe we need to look for other solutions. And that is what worries me. Because that affects also the level of ambition.
I'm sure we will come back on this, certainly in the January update after the next European Council. But turning to the MFF and leaving aside a moment of what price Orban might demand. And as you said, there can't be an operational solution here. There they need to get a deal. But Helena Hahn in the audience asks, can you shed a bit more light on how the fight over fresh money versus redeployments under the MFF played out, and what the negotiating box released today tells us about this? What does it tell us about the EU's ability to manage geopolitical challenges in Ukraine and beyond? And just to be clear, and underlining what Janis said earlier, Charles Michel put out a statement at 4:40 this morning about the MFF, 4:40 in the morning. He was having a very long night, saying it is firmly supported by 26 heads of state or governments. We will revert early next year. So really two questions. What was the nature of the compromise that he's put on the table? And linking to our earlier discussion about giving the EU the means to operate, whether they be the tools, policies, voting rules, etc., or the money? Because one of the other things the conclusions say is successful European integration requires that union policies be for the future and financed in a sustainable manner. And I'm wondering whether you feel the emerging deal, what does it look like, to answer Helena's question, and does the emerging deal suggest that EU leaders are prepared to make sure that it is for the future and financed in a sustainable manner? Who wants to come in first on this one? Janis is smiling wryly, so I'm going to come to him first. Janis.
I think well, there are two sides of the story. First of all, if you follow the MFF review and where we were at 440, as you said last night, it's the old logic which is prevailing. It's the logic of juste retour, who gets what out of it, the frugals fighting to make sure that the new money will be as small as it can be. The Commission asked for more than 60 billion originally. Now we're at roughly around 20. A compromise proposal had been 22. Then we ended up at 21, which was sending a signal to the frugals, okay, we understood your message. But at the same time, at least they came to a situation where the 26 agreed. It could have been also that there would not have been agreement, that it would have been postponed. And if you look into MFF negotiations in the past, we've had this saga going on and on. And at the end of the day, you also wondered, was it really necessary to have these fights to, at the end of the day, have a deal which, yes, is different from the last one, the last proposal which had been on the table, but it hadn't been hugely different. But you had to have the ritual. So at least now we had a quicker decision, because also we had the Hungary situation. But overall, if you look into as to whether this attitude is the attitude which needs to prevail in terms of the future, if you look into all the challenges we have with the poly transitions, also with respect to Ukraine, and God forbid if we have Trump too, the challenges will be even higher. Are we ready to face these kind of situations? If the old logic prevails, and it is the old logic which at the end of the day prevails, that is not enough, by far not enough.
Okay.
And by the way, if you see, because Helena was asking where they were cutting, it's interesting to see where they actually are cutting things. And it's no surprise. European Globalization Adjustment Fund, that was something which was cut. And another not surprise, especially if you also have been working in that area, Horizon money is being cut. It's the usual suspects, where those who are defending these particular elements are not as strong as those who actually are looking to redivert old money into new bottles.
So Fabian, linking this to your appeal, which you have made on many updates, for a greater focus on the strategic goals and then providing the means, and I read those council conclusions there and what they say, do you get the sense that EU leaders are at all prepared to really put their money where their mouth is? They're saying the right things, but are they going to do it? I'm hearing from Janis, no, very much not.
I think we are back in the territory of what we have been consistently admonishing since Russia's invasion, that we talk about Zeitenwende, but we don't actually translate that into our policy areas. The reality is that we are having, yes, a slightly different discussion of the MFF, in the sense that there are these new priorities which are now clearly on the agenda, but in principle, nothing has changed. We are talking about still, let's try to keep the MFF as small as possible. Let's try not to put any more burden on any countries. Let's have something which reflects the juste retour logic. For some countries, it very clearly is about maximizing what they're getting out. So yes, we are seeing some movements of reform, and it's better than having no agreement whatsoever. Although it has to be noted, we haven't got unanimous agreement,
Exactly.
so we'll see where that goes. But in reality, it is again coming back to what we've said before. It's the progress illusion that ultimately, when we look at the scale and the scope of the challenges we are facing, and the money we would need to put into those different areas, we're nowhere near. And at some point in time, we are also going to have discussions on very difficult political subjects, taxation, for example. There is no way we are not going to move towards some form of common taxation given the challenges we are facing. There is no way that we are not going to move towards some form of Eurobonds given the kind of challenges we are facing. But instead of having that kind of discussion now, we are going to get to the point of crisis when something will have to happen quickly, and it will then happen, but it will happen badly, and it will happen in a way which doesn't actually help us to reach the long-term goals which we're trying to pursue. So this is a completely non-strategic way of approaching the question of financing.
Thank you very much. Janis, I know you've been keeping an eye out. I have tried to as well. I can't see any sign of any written conclusions. I know the summit press conferences are in full swing, and you mentioned something that Ursula von der Leyen said there. But let us assume that what we're hearing, that there are no conclusions at all on Gaza. What should we read into that? I mean, we saw at the last summit, and we've seen in United Nations Council resolutions calling for ceasefires, the most latest one. We saw another split, different member states going different ways on this. How serious are these divisions? Do you think that's what lies behind the lack of conclusions? I can't remember a situation in which you have something on such a scale and of such significance happening in the world, and there isn't a sentence on it in the conclusions. This suggests very serious and deep divisions, or am I overreading it?
No, there are serious. Well, we knew that there are serious divisions among the EU27, and there were also at the last gathering of the European Council serious divisions, and they were discussing for hours at the last time. But at least they came up with a compromise solution, which no one was 100% happy with. But that's how compromises are. So if they now have not been able to reach a joint conclusion in one form or the other, this is not a good sign. What it indicates is that both sides on the ones who are at the different ends of the spectrums of different opinions among the 27 think that it is better not to have a compromise, because they want to thus send the signal that we are firm in our position. Either it is a position which is more in favor of one of the party of conflict, or the position which is more in favor of the other side. So this is not good news. And it is not good news also because it means that it diminishes the potential of the EU playing any role in this conflict. And if you look already in what role the EU is playing in terms of this conflict, it is minor. It is obviously not the EU, which is a major player. So the fact that they were discussing it again today for a long time, not being able at this point in time to come up with a conclusion, is definitely a bad signal. Also with respect to the future, not only for today, but also with respect to the future.
Absolutely. And Charles Michel, Fabian, said in his letter to the members of the European Council in advance, he said, this will be a prominent item on our agenda. We must call for all hostages to be released. We must vigorously address the alarming humanitarian situation in Gaza. He was making it very clear that he wanted to see very strong language on this issue. And apparently, we may be wrong, but the word is we see no language at all. How do you read that?
We don't know yet whether that's the case, but that's the indication. But even if they had found a language, it probably wouldn't have been very decisive. I wouldn't have expected something strong, because you have too many differences and heartfelt differences also between the different parties. But this is also going back to what we have said before, even in this update, about reacting to the Zeitenwende, reacting to the watershed moment. Europe can no longer afford to be seen as this divided, impossible continent which cannot find any kind of resolution on these issues. I think it is something which is going to very much impact on Europe's ability to pursue its values and its interests in the global arena. And that's something which will also have very strong implications for Ukraine. And we shouldn't forget that these issues in the minds of the global audience are very much linked. They belong together. And what you hear when you're going to other countries outside Europe is the accusation of double standards, the accusation of hypocrisy is very much at the forefront. So I think at the very least, Europe should have been able to come to a conclusion. I think, yes, it is simplistic, but I do not see why Europe cannot at least reiterate that two wrongs don't make a right, and that Europe continues to support the two-state solution and is willing to also put political capital, financing, etc., behind that.
Indeed.
So even a very simplistic solution like that, which doesn't capture all the complexity, but that we're not even able to say something like that, I think is a very bad sign for Europe's role in the world, and also, unfortunately, for Ukraine and all the other objectives we have. And I
And
haven't
it's
even
also
started
quite
talking about
striking. I mean,
climate change, etc.
I've covered summits for 25 years. I can't remember a time when we didn't have the conclusions in front of us as the press conferences began, so that questions could be asked about what was in those conclusions. We don't see any of day two yet, but the other items that were on the agenda were defence and security. Janis, you have long lamented the lack of progress in that area. It was an area Charles Michel in his letter said we really do need to make progress in this area. There was also supposed to be another discussion. It goes back to the point Fabian made earlier about the strategic agenda and where we are with that. Was there a sense, Janis, we haven't seen the conclusion, so we don't know what they have said on security and defence. Was there any sense that real progress might be made at this summit? Brief one, if you would, because I want to try and wrap things up with a couple of final questions.
As you said, we have seen over the past 12 months and longer that progress in the area of security and defense has been rather slow. By the way, also at the national level, if you look into how the level of individual national preparedness is increasing in these areas is not very high. But if you look into European cooperation, EU member state cooperation, we see that there are increasing differences among member states, also in the security, especially in the defense industry domain. So I would not have expected that there would have been major breakthroughs. Also, by the way, if you look into the negotiating box on the MFF review, you will not see that the amounts which are being provided in that area are huge, at least given my reading of the significance of the area and the potential challenges that will come up for the EU member states. Again, referring to, and I'm not saying that this is the likely scenario, but just thinking aloud, if we would have Trump too, the level of our preparedness will have to dramatically increase, and we might not have the time. So I think that my expectations were low. I think if we're going to see the final text, and not only the draft, but the final text, I don't think that we should expect that there will be much of a progress in that area.
Now, I want to squeeze one question in from Zuleeg. Apologies if I mispronounced that in the audience, saying, building on the Gaza question, how should we interpret the current sense of quietude surrounding Turkey, which is notably striking, especially in light of the recent Borrell report? Can either of you help us on that? I think it's not something they were discussing at all at the council. No, we can't really shed any light there. Okay, we are coming to the end of the last update of 2023, and I have a challenge for you. So my first is a question, which is, we are coming to the end of a year which has seen yet another chapter open in what the EPC has coined the perma-crisis, with the situation in the Middle East. The Charles Michel letter before the summit said, we are faced once again with the need to take bold decisions that require our collective strength and determination and the audacity to make the right choices. What is your key priority for the coming 12 months if the EU is to step up to the plate in 2024? And the challenge, after a year in which we have been accused on Update often of being very gloomy and too downbeat. It's Christmas, and I would like to try and send our audience away with a little bit of Christmas cheer. So is there any positive thing that you can pull out of the developments of recent months that we can say, okay, things are tough. There's a lot of areas where things are not happening in the way we think they should, but there are some glimmers of hope. So what is your priority for the next 12 months? And can you try to give us a glimmer of hope before we end? Fabian, you're usually accused of being the most gloomy of us, so I'm going to go to you first.
This is going to be a challenge. I think starting with what is the priority, I think it's coming back to what we've repeated many times, including in this update. It's about let's start to have that strategic discussion. What is it we need to achieve? What are the key things which are on the agenda? And what are the trade-offs we're going to have to take into account? What are the distributional consequences of that? How do we deal with the political economy of these questions? And I think that is still a debate which is not happening in Europe. It's happening in other countries outside Europe who are thinking very carefully about where Europe is going. But we are, at this moment in time, still unable to have that strategic discussion. And I think that has to be the starting point
And
for
your
what we
positive
do
note?
next year. On the positive note, I'll do a bit of a cop out. The positive note is that at least I'm getting the feeling that more and more people are now starting to realize how deep the difficulties are, which we are in. And it's only when we start facing these difficulties that we have any chance of actually tackling them. I think we have to be able to also go to populations and to say, this is a crisis situation which will require all of us to do things which are painful, which are not in the usual run of things. I think only if we start to becoming that honest, that we are going to have a chance to address it. So at the very least, other people are getting as gloomy as us.
So the old adage that the EU only really can take the really tough decisions when it stares over the abyss and realizes the consequences of not taking them, you're hopeful that that may happen again. Janis, your key priority, and if you can, your optimistic note.
I think that, and I'll pick up where Fabian left us. If I go back 1.5 years ago, I had the strong appreciation that that was 3-4 months after the 24th of February, that we were not aware of potentially what the consequences of what we call the Zeitenwende, and it's not a German, a European, it's a global Zeitenwende, are, and how, and I think now there is more of an understanding of how far-reaching the geopolitical, the geoeconomic consequences, and the potential consequences might be. And we are taking things more serious. If you look at the enlargement debate, at least we now have more of a concrete enlargement debate. I think 1.5 years ago, there were still a lot of people who were trying to not see the unavoidable. And now they see that it is an imperative, which doesn't mean that enlargement will happen or what scale enlargement will look like, but at least we understand that it is significant. With respect to EU reform, the same. We have at least an appreciation that we need to reform the EU in light of the geopolitical imperative of enlargement and the geopolitical imperative of the Zeitenwende. So we understand that we need to reform the European Union. And I could go on. There is a better appreciation of the potential consequences. Also, for example, when it comes to China. And in the old logic of what you were describing, Jacki, of we have a challenge, we want to avoid that the situation will get out of control, we need to do whatever it takes. If you take that old logic, we're performing rather well. So even in a situation like yesterday, at least 26 were able to agree on the MFF review. We found an ability to start negotiations with the Ukraine, and the other alternative would have been much worse. So the system operates on the basis of the old logic. The question is whether the old logic is the logic which we actually require. And here I come to what I believe is the biggest challenge. And the biggest challenge is those areas where if we are confronted with the worst potential scenario, we are not able to react along the lines of the old logic where we say we'll find a solution within months' time, within 6 months, a year's time, and that is security and defense. Because if Putin is watching us, if the EP elections do not go well, if the US elections do not go well, he might challenge us.
Okay.
Are we prepared for such a situation? That is what worries me. And that's where the old logic that no longer works. But I hope that the fact that we have at least understood how bad the situation is, and that we are more brutally honest, as I would say, I think is good news. It's not bad news.
Okay, you started to slip back into gloom, but you managed to rescue it at the last moment. So thank you very much. Fabian, you wanted to come back in 30 seconds because we need to wrap up.
Yeah, very quickly, I just also wanted to highlight that we shouldn't forget that we also have the global climate crisis, which is happening and which is continuing to happen with what I would say are rather disappointing results from COP, which do not move us in the right direction. So I'm sorry to add that bit of gloom at the end, but I think it's really important that we don't lose sight that that is also a crisis we have to tackle.
Well, and also just to mention, we are coming to the end of the season, but the EPC has not stopped working yet. There are several events next week, including on Tuesday, one precisely on COP28, on the outcomes and the next steps for global climate cooperation. There's also one on Monday on taking stock of the Spanish Council presidency. So issues very much related to what we've been discussing. I am sorry we have run out of time, gentlemen. It has, as go on, Janis.
Yes,
10 seconds.
just to say that 3 minutes ago, the European Council conclusion came out. I had a quick look because I knew the original version. It looks that we were right, both with respect to security and defense, and by the way, also with respect to migration.
Thank you very much indeed. That is all we have time for. That is the last EPC update of 2023. But as I said earlier, we will be back in the new year. I would imagine now, we haven't fixed the date yet because we don't know it, but after the emergency extraordinary European Council to settle the MFF question and the Ukraine aid package. So we will be back again, and I'm sure we're going to come back on many of these issues. But in the meantime, it only remains me to thank Janis and Fabian, as always, for a great discussion, and to thank all of you who've joined us today. Thank you to all of you who join us on a regular basis. It's always lovely to have you with us, and we wish you a very happy Christmas and a happy new year, and we will see you in 2024. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.